is Roger Green, host of the Surfing the NASH Tsunami podcast. This weekend, we are offering 4 conversations from episode 15, our post-event discussion of the Liver Forum meeting. Since one of the rules for the forum is that all conversation stays in the room, this is a bit different than the way we cover other major events, but I think it's a great conversation. From the vault, we have season 3, episode 26.2, with Quentin Anstey leading the group and considering what a year ago were novel thoughts about best use of NITs. This conversation focuses on the day 2 opening session, which was dedicated to statistics. Given that it was April Fool's Day and a Saturday morning, Veronica discloses she was thoroughly impressed by how well it played out as an entertaining opener session. Jeff McIntyre and I each concur by sharing different perspectives on how this session succeeded, with Jeff as a non-statistics person praising the clever openings and clear practical messages in the conversations, and me with a background in statistics, noting that at their essence, both presentations shared a kernel of clear patient-centric logic buttressed by statistical concept more than the numbers per se. The talks in question came from Scott Evans of George Washington University, who opened his talk on the desirability of outcome ranking, or DOR analysis, with a fantastic opening jokes. And Lauren Dung of UC Berkeley, and soon to be NIH, whose talk covered hybrid randomized real-world data designs, a case study of semaglutide and cardiovascular outcomes, which presented a potentially complex topic in a very clear way. After hearing Jeff's reaction and mine, Veronica adds her thoughts around the benefits of bringing together data from different sources to inform how the field conducts clinical trials, especially after drugs are approved. As she comments, ultimately we don't want patients on placebo. As you can hear, a lot of really interesting conversations and some novel ideas emerged from the Liver Forum meeting last weekend. It's a lot to take in and some interesting perspectives, so sit back, listen, enjoy, learn, and when you're done, join the dialogue on our LinkedIn discussion group. So, Veronica, do you have another example of a different session where the same kind of thing happened? Ferment led to insight you might not have predicted at the beginning?
Veronica Miller.
Since I'm so involved in the agenda and building the agenda, the one session that I myself, because it was sort of where I took my own prerogative and said, okay, we're going to have the statistical session on Saturday morning, where I really wasn't sure how that would go. I knew both speakers, myself, and I was confident that they would do a good job, but it is Saturday morning and, it is April Fool's Day and who knows what to expect, right? But it flowed so well. It actually flowed even beyond my wildest expectations in terms of everything we had already talked about. And then I had not given Scott any specific instructions. I just said, remember, these are not statisticians in the audience. There will be some, but most are not. And the way, he started his talk about saying, you put the patient first. And that was so conducive to distilling everything we talked about into setting up the last panel. I could not have designed it better had I thought about it. So just again, how this all comes together. So that I thought was a session that between what he talked about and what Lauren Dung talked about, who is so brilliant, and she will have such a huge contribution to the NIH biostatistics at NIID, to really think about how can we then bring together data from other sources to supplement how we do clinical trials, because we don't want people on placebo. And of course, that all feeds into our placebo database working group and project, etc. But also how Scott set it up with you put the patient first, and then you kind of look back at that journey. But it's all about the patient journey. When we talk about biopsy at baseline and biopsy at 6 months and at 1 year, those are cross sections, or those are times and points of a patient journey. We don't get the patient journey there. We get it through everything else that happens in between those biopsies. And that's sort of the sadness of the biopsy, is that it just gives us such limited information, and everything else that happens in between is really what's so important. So I felt that session to me I was truly worried about that one, and it just went beyond what I could have wished for. They really pulled it off. But the discussion afterwards, right, how people came together and said, well, how can we apply this to NASH? You will have to watch the slides for those in the audience, but I will just say it here, we will have an adorable NASH working group, and you'll need to look at the slides to know exactly why I'm saying that.
My background is in statistics, and one of the things I believe in, Veronica, I think you and I have had this conversation, is that great statistics are always counterintuitive. So if you're going to set up a discussion like the last panel, bringing a lot of counterintuitivity to the party and different ways of looking at things, as both Scott and Lauren did, I thought it just created a space for people to think about everything very differently. And that question is a question that needs to be thought about differently, because the vantage points that are going to matter most are going to be vantage points that aren't necessarily those of the academician or even of the commercial marketers, but really the patients and the line treaters. You have to figure out how not to think like you, but to think like them.
Yeah, I'd love to hear what Jeff thought about that statistics session.
Jeff McIntyre.
Wow, what a great segue. Thank you, Veronica. I have to admit that when you announced at the end of day one of statistics leading off on day two, as the resident non-medical liberal arts major coming into this, I was thinking, oh, wow, this is going to be challenging. This is going to be interesting to hear kind of where it goes. And I was kind of eager to challenge myself with, am I going to keep up with this? Is this going to be a different language? Kind of just where does it go in this regard? And I've taken statistics classes, and so I kind of knew enough to know that I didn't know. And I think that one of the things that really impressed me about both of the presentations, it certainly was the content, but was actually the linkage of the content to NASH and to the other aspects of the field, if you will, at that point. And that's where it became really resonant. It helped that both of the speakers were really charismatic, really engaging, and with no disrespect to any of the other topics that we addressed, but I think Scott posing the question to the audience of which would you rather be, smarter or better looking, was the one dilemma that seemed to mix people up during the session. But it really set a very informal...
Mazen Noureddin.
Yeah, we were interested in other things just too as well. I stopped worrying about my look after my 40 years birthday, so I rose my hand for the smart for sure. I need to be smarter and forget about look after 40. After being 10 years in marriage, it's good enough.
And so it allowed for a much more kind of casual, informal sort of consideration. He had the great example at the start of the conversation, had the great joke at the end of the conversation. It felt much more relaxed. And so to me, those were great conversations. Lauren's presentation about real-world data design and focusing specifically on semaglutide was really relevant for me because I've been hearing and seeing so much pushback on Wegovy and semaglutide since coming from other sectors. And so it was really great to see it kind of represented in a more data-proven and more sufficient way. Just extraordinary sessions. I will say that I do think that its lead into the panel discussion afterwards, that it kind of evolved in an unexpected way to me. And I think that if we'd been able to harness the energy and the substance of those two better into that final panel, the substance of that final panel could have given us some really good action items that unfortunately I don't think that we quite got to.
Jörn Schattenberg.
Again, I missed that session, so I can't really comment on the content, but just revisiting it here through the comments, makes it looking forward to what comes out of that working group. I don't think I've joined a working group yet, Veronica. You still will want to pick one and thinking about this one.
Well, so speaking for our colleague, Dr. Noureddin, I would suggest that your Matt Damon looks to point you in the adorable direction because he's nothing if not adorable. And
that's stuck with this podcast here.
Yeah, it's stuck with me, I got to tell you. And I'm just got to figure out who's Ben Affleck, and we'll have the whole thing worked out.
I have nothing to do with this. Well, I started it, but...
As soon as it took off, you immediately ran away and tried to deny all knowledge.
So, Veronica, just like the backup story, on one podcast, I said Dr. Schattenberg is the Matt Damon of hepatology. Look at him. And then he didn't like it. I'm like, it's exactly the opposite.
Look
Matt
at
Damon
that innocent grin and smile on your face.
Right? What can I say? I mean,
very liked in this country, so I was...
They are worse comparisons, but then again...
It's archived for history, Mazen. You can't deny that you started this.
But the interesting thing is what he really wanted was for you to turn to, oh no, Mazen, you look much more like Matt Damon than I do.
And now, back to Roger.
We hope you've enjoyed this recording. If you have any questions or comments about the content of this conversation or the entire episode, please put them in the review section of the page from which you downloaded this conversation or send an email to questions@surfingnash.com. Next week, Donna Cryer will be joining us along with a couple of others to discuss why NASH Day 2023 is so important for the future of how we treat the disease and how we look at it. It's going to be a fantastic conversation. So until then, stay safe, surf on, whatever religion you celebrate. This is an important weekend, so have a good one, and we'll see you next week on the podcast. Bye-bye now.